my thanks to Giulia and Zrinka for putting together this seminar. It's already been a very stimulating experience, and I look forward to learning more as the event goes on. I'm very grateful, especially to Giulia, for the invitation and for her correspondence over the months. She set a very challenging program, and among other things, calls on us to refresh our language in a non-ethnocentric, non-linear, non-idealizing, non-neoclassical perspective. That description sets so high a standard for academic rigor that I am bound to fail, but as the playwright says, no matter, try again, fail better. I agree with the organizers that the challenge of decolonizing classics is thought-provoking rather than threatening, that it's an opportunity rather than an impasse. And I might even go so far as to say that this is the moment that we've been waiting for. At any rate, decolonizing calls for multiple approaches along many fronts, given how the histories of classics and colonialism vary. And this paper explores an approach that is sensitive to the colonial experience in India. An ancient Greek epic poem begins with anger. I think you know that poem. Another ancient epic poem, which is not in Greek and with which you may be familiar, begins with grief as well as anger. In fact, the poem reflects on its own origins even as it sets sail. In that poem, the poet, but the word poet is inadequate since Valmiki is rarely a rishi, that is also a seer or a sage. The poet, the seer, the sage is wandering through a forest. Valmiki is recounting to himself perhaps the story of Rama and Sita, a story that has just been related to him. As he walks in the forest, Valmiki observes two herons in the forest, one male, the other female, and the two birds are making love. Lovebirds, he thinks. But as he watches, and to his horror, a hunter strikes down and kills the male bird. In Arsha Sattar's translation, compassion welled up in Valmiki's heart when he saw the fallen bird killed so unrighteously and the grief of its mate. Deeply moved, he said, "Hunter, because you killed this bird while he was making love, you shall never find a resting place." As soon as he had spoken, Valmiki thought to himself, "What are these words that I uttered in my grief for the bird?" Learned and wise, the sage said to his disciples, "My words came forth in a meter of 4 feet with equal syllables that can be sung to the notes of the veena. Since this meter arose from my grief, shoka, let it henceforth be known as the shloka meter." At the beginning of the Ramayana, shoka leads to shloka, grief leads to verse, and with that play on words, the narrative suggests that grief or anguish lead to poetry. Valmiki is by an act of killing moved to sadness, pain, and grief, and in his suffering, he pronounces an angry curse on the hunter, "You shall never find a resting place." That curse is the first speech in meter, and it is this metrical form that Valmiki will use to recount much of the story of Rama and Sita in his grand epic. The epic begins with a story about its own creation. It draws on metaphor and metonymy, exults in linguistic playfulness and innovation, shows a dense emotional register, and manifests a sharp awareness of the performative nature of language. It is self-conscious and illustrative, and offers an instance of what in another tradition might be called mimesis. The grief of the female bird is then felt by Valmiki, who transmits his own sadness to the audience, which arguably then registers its own loss at the incident. The episode implies that poetry comes out of trauma. The poet's task is to bear witness to the trauma and to offer redress. The first poetic utterance is a curse, perhaps, because, as another poet writes, poetry has a role in the world, however disregarded, to chastise violence and call out injustice. We might readily compare this episode of the Ramayana with the opening of the Iliad, which begins with the anger of Achilles and the invocation to the muse. The Greek poem too is founded in strong emotion and recounts the pain of its heroes. Achilles' own name has been reconstructed linguistically as Achilleos, which is understood in the specialized language of Homeric poetry to mean he who has achos, grief, but the people, laos. That is, he who has grief and who shares the grief of his people, the Achaeans. Or we might compare the episode from the Ramayana with the moment in Aeschylus's Agamemnon when two eagles devour the hare's young. Or we might turn to the many Greek tragedies that are concerned with justice and the restoration of moral equilibrium. Or we might choose to reflect on Plato and Aristotle and their comments on the value of literature and mimesis. Or in fact, we might read the Ramayana alongside any number of resonant texts from the Greek tradition. As these remarks might suggest, I would like to make the case for a broadening of our notion of the classical and suggest that we might move in that direction by thinking comparatively of what it means to be classical. In this case, I propose, and of course I am far from being the first to do so, that we think comparatively about Greek, Roman, and Indian conceptions of classics. By Indian, I don't refer only to Sanskrit, but also to material in Tamil and diverse languages. Other historical cultures could be introduced into the discussion as well, and the reason I refer to India is that its cultural situation is one that I understand better than, say, China or Iran. Modern European colonialism is one reason why India is not studied widely as a classical culture outside of India, at least. And this is a framework that I hope to explore further in the rest of my remarks. Colonialism is not the only reason, and it needs to be said that even within contemporary India, there's been an extensive and pervasive erosion of knowledge about ancient India, its languages and literatures. Since many religious traditions in India today continue to trace their roots back to ancient times, a strong incentive remains for the religious and spiritual exploration of ancient languages and literatures. Secular approaches to ancient Indian history and culture have suffered considerably in the decades since 1947. Interest in the concept of classical cultures extend further back beyond the 20th century in South Asia, however, and colonialism needs to be part of the analysis. Many of the early Britons who wrote about South Asia were aware that India possessed a history, although they were not certain of its extent or its details and complexity. From a European perspective, India's history would be worked out by the first generation of Orientalists who begin to publish their works in the 18th century. Numerous translations and publications by the Orientalists begin to appear in the 1780s and lead to the transformation of European knowledge about India. William Jones' English translation of the Sanskrit play Shakuntala by Kalidasa appears in 1789, for instance. One important feature of this phase of early British Orientalism was the Orientalists' wide conception of ideas of the classic, classics, and classical. Jones used to talk about Persian and Arabic classics by the 1770s and classical Sanskrit by the 1790s. Scholars often point to the years around 1800 as an important moment in the history of European knowledge systems. And one reason it is important is that it is the moment when the potential for a global conception of the classical is opened up. Hellenism enjoyed a prestige in Europe thanks to the impact of Winckelmann, Herder, Wolff, and others, and classicism and Hellenism were inextricably linked in Western Europe. Yet there was an opening here, a small opening, admittedly, for Chinese, Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit also to achieve a lofty status, possibly even to rival Greek and Latin. This opening is never realized, of course, and Greek and Latin continue to attain unassailable heights in Europe over the 19th century. The traces of this moment still linger on in the non-European cultures to which I refer, so that classics in an Indian context may still encompass Sanskrit, and in an Iranian context may encompass Persian, whereas classical literature in Western Europe or North America largely refers to the Greek and Roman texts. The context of colonialism offers some explanation as to why the opening could not really have been developed in Western Europe in the late 18th or 19th centuries. For all the love that the early Orientalists showed for other languages and cultures, they were operating within inherited frameworks of literary and cultural study. By translating works of Persian or Sanskrit literature into English, they were placing these texts within national frameworks of literature that were emerging in Europe at the time. The density, complexity, and diversity of the many texts and traditions of South Asia, for example, were rendered into a structure known as the literature of India. But India, as a consistent and holistic entity of this type, was itself an imaginary nation more or less dreamed into existence by the Orientalists themselves. Conceptions of Hindustan or Bharat were certainly articulated in South Asia prior to the advent of the Orientalists, but as Amir Mufti says, it's in the new Orientalist studies and in their wider reception that the subcontinent is first conceived of in the modern era as a single cultural entity, a unique civilization with its roots in the Sanskritic and more particularly Vedic texts of the Aryans. And to a significant extent, not exclusively, not mainly, but to a significant extent, the understanding of Indian nationhood culture and literature that emerged in the Orientalism of the early 19th century are indebted to analogies based on ancient Greece and Rome. This is partly why Sanskritic Hindu antiquity is held up as the bedrock of Indian civilization at the time, and it's a construction of Indian antiquity that continues to have a wide resonance today, even though it flattens out what from other perspectives may be described as a multilingual, multi-faith, multi-ethnic, geographically diverse historical situation. Once the category of Indian literature and the attendant category of classical, meaning Sanskrit Indian literature, were available in the 19th century, these could be involved in discussions of world literature, as indeed they were in the writings of the German Romantics and others. But these discussions were being worked out in relation to ideas of the nation, of literature, of world literature in a European context. That is to say, these ideas were largely legible and intelligible within European ideas of nationhood and literature, and fit more awkwardly with the evolving and historical textual and cultural traditions of South Asia. This predicament of Indian literature also meant that it was to be judged by European canons of taste, style, and value, and that its texts, authors, and traditions would be evaluated and hierarchized accordingly. It was a predicament that almost inevitably led to the views of such figures as Thomas Macaulay, who in the 1830s famously valued English literature above Sanskrit and Arabic. I suggest instead that in order to arrive at a sharper understanding of why ancient Greek, Roman, or Indian traditions are so distinctive and impactful, we need to think about them comparatively. And on this point, I couldn't agree more with Giulia's comments at the beginning. It's through comparative analysis that we might better understand, for example, why the Ramayana and the Iliad came to be privileged over other compositions as first poems. Comparison will work to open up the disciplinary exclusivism of the classical as a Western category. It is significant that in a globalized world with so many passionate views about the cultural past, there are few, if any, studies of how the classical is itself a global idea. Thank you.